And if you're not failing, then you're not trying your hardest as a climber. And so with philanthropy, you obviously want to have the most impact possible, but you have to be comfortable with some degree of failure, or else you're just not having the correct impact.
Awesome. So, Alex, why don't you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to get excited about solar energy and start the Honnold Foundation?
Well, yeah, so I started the Honnold Foundation because I was just looking for something useful to do in the world. I felt like I should do something positive in some way. And I wanted to do something that was good for the environment. And then I felt like there's no point in supporting environmental projects that don't also improve human living conditions, or help human communities nearby or whatever. And so when I started the Honnold Foundation, I was just searching for projects that seemed to help both the environment and people. And those projects were often solar projects or solar focused, and so that's kind of why the Honnold Foundation has been focused on solar for so long. Um, it's sort of more a circumstance. It just happened to be the most elegant win-win solution to so many different environmental and social problems. And so over the years, we found that we were consistently supporting solar projects. So then we just explicitly made it around solar.
And tell me a little bit about why solar. What are some of those benefits that you have seen?
I mean, so I guess if you look at the scope of the problem, there's something like a billion people on Earth without access to power. And then you also look at the fact that humanity needs to decarbonize our energy use over my lifetime anyway to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And so you kind of look at the fact that humanity is already transitioning away from fossil fuels. So it's like we're going to renewables, we're going to solar. But that transition is probably not going to affect the billion people on Earth who don't have access to power right now, and presumably won't in the future. And I think that's where philanthropic projects can come in, and that's kind of the place for philanthropy, is to make sure that as the world transitions to renewables, we don't just replicate the same model that's left so many people behind in the past. I don't know. I mean, it's I hope you don't mind me just like rambling, but when I started the Honnold Foundation in 2012, it wasn't totally clear that we would be making the transition to renewables. It's like you could look at the trend lines and you could see the price of solar dropping and the price of batteries dropping, and all those, and you could expect that eventually it would happen, but you never really know. And so when I started the Honnold Foundation, I felt like a big part of the challenge was just helping that transition happen. And now, interestingly, a decade later, it's clear that the transition's happening, but it's equally clear that that transition won't help many people on Earth. And so I think that's kind of the role for organizations like the Honnold Foundation, is to make sure that as we transition to a slightly more environmentally friendly world, humans are uplifted by it as well, like all humans equally.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to talk about that because obviously a lot has changed in the 10 or 11 years since you've started in the field of solar. But I wonder, how has the work of the foundation and your leadership of it also evolved over that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, when I started the Honnold Foundation, it was just me giving 2 grants a year through what's called a donor advised fund in the U.S. And so it's basically just me donating some money. Now the Honnold Foundation is a full on organization, with full time staff, an executive director, and an actual tax status. And we've given over 2 million in grants the last couple of years, like each year for the last couple of years. And so the scale of the Honnold Foundation is vastly beyond what I imagined when I started it. But that's kind of the point. I mean, I started it with the desire to have the greatest impact that I could, and so it's really rewarding to see the fact that it's actually grown that much.
For sure. And this might be a little bit of an obvious question, but I wonder if you remember when you started to realize the climate crisis as a problem, and why it mattered to you.
Actually, I mean, I remember, if you know who Bill McKibbins is, like sort of environmental activist in the U.S. He wrote this book, Earth, or Earth, like Earth with an extra A, and and in it, I mean, I don't. It's been a long time, but basically, he argues that the Earth of the future will not be the Earth of the past. It's like we are now living on a new Earth as the climate changes. And I remember that idea kind of sticking with me, that through my lifetime, what I think of as Earth will no longer be the same.
Yeah.
I mean, you're seeing that in, well, I mean, yeah, it's like, I don't know. I'm sure you know enough about climate to know that we're seeing that play out. And I mean, that's what's kind of crazy. Like, I'm not that old, but I've been reading
Yeah.
environmental nonfiction, since I graduated school. And I'm already starting to see the predictions from 10 or 15 years ago play out. You're like, oh, this is the world we're living in, like greater wildfires, like greater droughts, great, bigger storms, more devastating storms, all the kinds of things that I've been reading about for 10, 15 years. I'm like, now we're living it. And yeah, anyway, that's a whole different train of thought. But basically, I don't know if there was a specific moment, but I think I've just always known that climate will be the defining issue of my generation, I think.
And did you know that before you started climbing full time and making that your career?
No, I think you're probably right that my environmental awareness definitely rose hand in hand with my climbing. Like the more time I was spending outside, the more I was going on expeditions, the more I was reading about it. Actually, and a lot of the reading I was doing was very much tied to expeditions I was going on, because the first trips that I went on, I would make a specific effort to read about the places I was going. So like my first trip to Africa, I read, several books about Africa, and it's hard to uh, read, a whole history of Africa without starting to read about climate and
I'd love to hear about one project that you are especially proud of and that you know has made a real difference for the community.
I mean, which one? Um, I'll give you two at sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, so one that I really like, but is very simple in some ways, is an organization we supported called Asociación Maya. It's like a school for indigenous girls in Guatemala, and it's just a grid. It's just panels on the roof of the school. So the school is grid tied. All it's doing is saving them some money. But to me, that's the perfect kind of project, because it's educating indigenous girls. Which, if you've ever read like Project Drawdown or any of the big climate
Mm.
change sort of books, like like empowering women, and particularly empowering indigenous women, is like one of the great solutions for climate. uh, and it's like obviously great for human communities. Like everything about it just feels win-win-win. We're like, this is the way the world should be. But so that project with Association Maya is in some ways the simplest kind of project that we support, because you're just putting panels on roofs, but you're helping the right people save money to spend it on the right kinds of projects, which in this case is educating women. So a project like that, I'm like, very simple, but like clean, obvious. It's the kind of project where you're like, why isn't that already being funded by the local government or by whoever else? Because it's so obviously the right thing to do. So at the other end of the spectrum, we've been supporting this project in Puerto Rico, in this town called Latuntas, this microgrid project, and that's been a very complicated long term. It's gone like way over budget and taken like 3 years longer than it's supposed to. But in some ways, that's kind of the point, because it's the first cooperative microgrid in Puerto Rico, and the first solar microgrid on the island. And that's the kind of project that can be seen as a proof of concept. And I mean, they're currently in the process of basically changing policy to accommodate this new microgrid. And that's the kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of like a Honnold Foundation project at its best, when it can like catalyze new policy decisions and like create a new thing, like show a proof of concept, like show that this works. And in a place like Puerto Rico, a solar microgrid is the most obvious solution. I mean, after Hurricane Maria, or whatever the last crazy, I mean, now it's been I guess 5 or 6 years since Hurricane Maria, but large sections of the island went without power for months because the grid is old and it's diesel powered. I mean, I'm like, how much am I allowed to rant here? There's like this whole crazy colonial legacy of
Yeah.
importing diesel to the island. It's like it's way too expensive. It's unreliable. It doesn't make any sense. And then you're talking about an island that gets a ton of sunshine. You're like, it makes way more sense for people to be in control of their own energy through things like a cooperative solar microgrid. And so the project in Puerto Rico, you're like, this is an example of the way the world can and should be, but just isn't quite yet. And so I think that's a real opportunity for the Honnold Foundation to sort of help demonstrate what's possible.
I'm curious what you hear about from your grantees after the projects. What are some of the impacts? What are some of the ways that they've seen their communities and their work change because of solar and maybe batteries, like in this case?
I mean, actually, we just had the sort of yearly staff board retreat if you call it a retreat, everybody came and hung out at my house and we went climbing and chatted and stuff. It's not like a retreat, but we all get together in person and talk about the work and talk about what we're doing. And one of the projects that the staff was really proud of, um, was a project that we've been supporting in the Brazilian Amazon. And they've seen that as they've done the install and brought solar and energy storage to the community, they've seen a lot of people return to the community. Like basically, they're the sort of standard flight that you see from rural communities like
Yeah.
that has been reversing because people have an opportunity to stay at home. And the Honnold Foundation staff found that very uplifting because they're like, what allows people to stay in the place that they want to live in because they suddenly have more economic opportunity and more connection. It's like once you have access to power, you can also use the internet, and so suddenly you can actually stay in the same place and like still be connected to the world.
You've probably learned some hard lessons along the way in trying to get the Honnold Foundation started and scale it to what it is today. I'm curious if you can share one or two of those lessons.
There have been some there definitely I mean, there have been some sort of failures where a project doesn't take off the way you hope it might, or it's just like a little bit half cooked. It's just not as well formed as you would like. Um, but some of that, and especially now that we have staff and we have more policy in place, and we have guidelines as to how we support our grantee partners, and basically we've grown up quite a bit. But I think even now, as a more grown up organization, we sort of expect to fail from time to time because if we don't, then we're just not taking the right risks. Like the thing is, sort of by definition, if you're serving the most rural, the most remote, the most unserved communities, some of those projects are going to fail. Not just from a technical perspective, though that may occasionally happen, like the devices don't work or whatever. Things can't get imported, like that kind of thing could happen. But also sometimes the organization just may not exist, or the whole thing might be. We recently had an example in let's see, where was it? It's somewhere in rural Africa, where the whole organization may or may not have been fraudulent. It's kind of hard to tell, and it's actually not even totally clear whether the project happened or not, because it may have actually happened, but we got like conflicting emails from different people claiming to be uh, like different potential whistleblowers. Or like one person has seen the project through, and there was actually independent media talking about the project, and so you're like, maybe it happened, but then somebody else saying that it didn't happen, and it's all fraud, and it's very hard to track down what's true and what isn't because it's the middle of nowhere. But ultimately, some percentage of projects should fail, or else you're just not helping the right people. What I mean? Like if you're guaranteed success in each project, then you're not reaching the hardest to reach communities. Like you're not truly helping the people the most in need.
And I think that that flows itself well to what I want to talk about next, which is some of the values that you've embedded the organization with around risk taking and trust in particular. It strikes me that there's some obvious parallels there between your rock climbing and your athletic life and these important values for the foundation. Can you tell me a little bit about what are some things that maybe you've carried through from your rock climbing into how you do the foundation work and why that's important?
Yeah, it's funny because yeah, so now I mean the Honnold Foundation, we've sort of explicitly embraced I don't want to say a high degree of risk, but we're willing to take risks that other big funders probably are not. When you think about big institutional philanthropy, they're just not
Yeah.
taking the types of risk that we feel comfortable with. Mostly because, yeah, I mean, I think when you come from climbing, you're used to taking risk and you're used to failing like all the time. And so, and if you're not failing, then you're not trying your hardest as a climber. And so with philanthropy, you obviously want to have the most impact possible, but you have to be comfortable with some degree of failure, or else you're just not having the correct impact. Um, but actually, trust also. I mean, so a lot of these things, I've always taken these sort of core values for granted because coming from the climbing world, you're like, that's just the way things are, and you think that's like, isn't everybody that way? Like, isn't this universal?
Yeah.
But actually, the Honnold Foundation staff has kind of helped me realize that this is unique to the way HF runs its philanthropy, and part of that is sort of trust based, where coming from the climbing world, you don't climb with somebody unless you trust them 100%. and then you trust them 100%. It's kind of like a binary. It's like either on or off. Like you're not going to climb with somebody you don't trust. And if you do decide to climb with them, you give them 100% trust. You're literally trusting your life to their hands. And so with the Honnold Foundation, we work hard to carefully vet our partners. And then once we're partnered with them, we give them unrestricted grants and we let them execute their project however they see fit. And so, basically we just trust them to do what's best for their community, which to me seems obvious and like that's how philanthropy should be. You're like only work with people that you trust, and then once you trust them, let them do whatever they think is best to execute the plan that they've laid out for you. But apparently that's not how all philanthropy is.
I'm curious to hear what are some of the biggest challenges that you are thinking about when starting this new year and all the work that you still have ahead of you with the Honnold Foundation. What are challenges on your mind or barriers?
I mean, for me, the biggest barrier, the biggest challenge is fundraising because we have this enormous pipeline of potential projects, and we could fund. I mean, we have something like $60 million in vetted projects that would work and are good and good organizations, and would have a positive impact on their community. And we're only funding something like $2 million worth of those projects a year. So, so really, the biggest challenge is for us to raise enough to be able to support all these great projects. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine that our budget will ever be that big. But if we were raising more than $50 million a year, let's say, then I think there would be a whole set of different types of problems where I think then you'd start to broaden the focus a little bit. And but I mean, for right now, there's just this huge pipeline of community solar projects that should be funded around the world.
Yeah, I guess that's a good problem to have for right now, that there is an abundance of opportunity.
Yeah, I would say
Um,
it's a very inspiring problem to have because
yeah,
it it's it keeps you motivated because you're like, oh, there's all this impact that we can
yeah.
have. All we have to do is connect people with the right donors, or find the right supporters, or whatever. But it's like we're doing great work, and there's tons of it to be done. All we need is to be able to do more of it.
What are you most excited for the foundation in 2024?
Um, I mean, what I'm kind of, basically the last year or two, it's felt like we've been on sort of right on the cusp of a few bigger foundations, like bigger institutional donors, things like that. Like, um, and maybe I won't name names, but like if you just imagine some of the big philanthropies in the world, the last couple of years we've been like kind of right on the edge of like, oh, a $5 million grant from somebody or whoever. It's like it just feels like we're about to step from being semi small to like semi medium. It's like, and I feel like it's time to take that step into the medium range. Because we have an incredible staff, we're doing great work. Like basically, all the pieces are in place, and it would be easy for us to take that next step now to sort of scale up just to the next level. And so I think that's kind of what I'm most excited about for 2024. I mean, I think that it's like right on the cusp. It's like it's about to happen because there's several irons in the fire where you're like, oh, there's several different big funders that keep sort of pushing things off or sort of delaying.
Yeah.
And so I mean, this year, one way or another, we'll sort of find out about a bunch of different potential bigger grants, and I think that could have a big impact.
I'm curious if there's something you wish more people knew or understood about solar energy or clean energy in general.
I wish people knew that it was the future. Like it's happening, it's here. Like just, I mean, there are a lot of, yeah. It's funny. Before or sort of concurrently, when I started the Honnold Foundation, I also started putting solar on a bunch of my family and friends' houses and stuff. Sort of like loaning people money or just putting panels on people's houses and whatever. Unrelated to the Honnold Foundation, but same sort of idea. Where I was just trying to do something good for my family. Um, and it's funny because like, I have an aunt and uncle who, I sort of offered to put solar on their house, and they were like, "No, it's like that's weird." Their main roof faces south, like toward the street, and so it'd be like very obvious in their neighborhood. But they live in California, and basically they weren't willing to be the first people on their street with solar, and it made me very annoyed because I was like, that in 15 years, every house on your street will have solar, and
Mhm.
you'll just be the last person to put it on. And I'm kind of like, why not be the first people and then save 15 years of energy production? Like And that to me is the mindset around solar that I'm like, why won't everybody just go a little faster?
Yeah.
Because it is happening. It's now the cheapest power in the world. Kind of like, why not? Why not just go with it? Like why is there such reluctance to change? It's like it's time to just move on.
I'm curious if there's any lessons you have about talking to people about solar that you've either learned or now have about some of these reluctances or like unknowns that a lot of folks still have.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think in the US, the conversation around energy is so polarized. And I think that a good way to get past that is to speak towards energy independence and sort of energy sovereignty, or however you want to frame it. But I have a different aunt and uncle, a different example, who are staunch Republicans, but have solar on their house and love it because they feel strong and independent, like they are providing their own power. And in the US, despite the polarized sort of environmental landscape, like, depending on how you frame environmental issues, you'll get wildly different responses. But everybody agrees that they want, basically, everybody's anti pollution. Like everybody hates
Yeah.
litter. Like everybody wants to have sort of a clean world around them. And people love parks and people love, taking their family to parks. And so I think when you frame energy transition in those terms, it's like, this is how you help, you know, keep your community clean. Like this is how you provide your own power. Like this is how you support your own family. It's like depending on who you're talking to, you can frame it in different ways, but there's always something that people agree on. Mostly because it's such an obvious solution. It's like it makes sense. It is
Yeah.
correct. Like you just have to find the right way to talk to people about it because you know, like when it is the right thing, there's some way to make people see that.
Just to close us out, I have a couple quick questions to throw your way. What do you think is a piece of advice worth passing on?
I don't know, just go for it. Do the thing. Like, I mean, it's not really advice, but just try do the thing that you're excited to do.
What would you say is your superpower?
Oh, that's funny. At the Honnold Foundation staff board retreat thing, we had a question that was, "What is your superpower, and how can you use it to help the Honnold Foundation, like to help the work that we're doing?" And I was like, if I had to identify a superpower, sadly, it would be free soloing big walls, which is very esoteric and very unrelated to this kind of work. But I suppose it does allow visibility for this kind of work. And I mean, it's the whole reason that the Honnold Foundation exists at all is because of films like Free Solo and because of my career as a climber. So I'm kind of like, well, if climbing is the one thing that I love to do, and it is probably the thing that I'm best at doing, I'm kind of like, well, may as well use that to. And that is a big part of why I started the Honnold Foundation because it's like there's this thing that I'm good at that I love to do, but it really has nothing positive to do for the world. And so, that's why I started HF to be like, if I'm going to take that kind of visibility, I might as well channel it into something that has a better purpose.
And it's fair to say that the visibility has only grown since you started the Honnold Foundation. Would you say that it's been a net positive for the organization and the work you're doing?
Oh yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, the greater visibility, the TV shows, the movies, like all the various things. I mean, they're all great for the work that HF is doing, which is part of why I started HF because that type of public facing behavior doesn't really make my personal life any better.
Yeah.
Like it allows me to support my family. It allows the my lifestyle. Like, it's great. I'm not complaining, but you never need to be more famous. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't allow you to do any of the things that you like to do, uh, really. But it does allow you to have a much bigger impact through things like the Honnold Foundation. And so, in that way, it makes it all a little bit more worth it.